Welcome to the Two Star Wars Nerds Book Club. Step into our cozy corner of the Star Wars universe, where we gather to celebrate the pre-Disney adult and young adult novels that ignited our imaginations and expanded the galaxy we love.
This podcast is your haven for revisiting the wonders of the expanded universe, where the Force flows strong and Disney canon takes a backseat. So whether you're a longtime Star Wars fan or just dipping your toes into the expanded universe, we're here to make you feel like you're chatting with old friends, because in the end, that's what being a Star Wars nerd is all about. Building connections through our shared love for this incredible universe. Alright, so here we are, starting The Last Command.
Woohoo!
Book 3
Yes.
of Timothy Zahn's Thrawn trilogy. So just a few things that are even interesting before we get into this. The Last Command actually became a New York Times best-selling novel, which is really cool.
Awesome.
Really helped propel the EU in particular into the spotlight, getting a lot of popularity, not only with Star Wars fans, but fans of science fiction. So that's pretty cool. Mm-hmm. And it was also a finalist for the 1994 Hugo Award for Best Novel.
Wow.
Which is really cool. And it's great. The Thrawn trilogy has really been great already. And essentially we're just coming to a climax of this awesome trilogy with Luke and Mara and Han and Leia, Thrawn. And Chewie.
Can't forget Chewbacca and Lando.
Yeah, and Lando and Joris, Sabaoth, so we have all this.
Even Pelion.
Yeah, Pelion. Pelion's a great character. So we have all this great stuff going on just right at the top, which is cool. And what we're going to do with the book club, since this is our inaugural episode of the audio-only podcast, we're going to just go chapter by chapter and really dig in deep. So we'll have kind of an overall YouTube video where we do our general thoughts and opinions and review and things, but we're going to go chapter by chapter, talk about what stood out to us, maybe even talk about some things that don't make sense, or just kind of go through the best we can and talk about it. So why don't you start kind of with some thoughts, and we'll just kind of go back and forth.
Sure, yeah. First, when I was reading, I was trying to find the timeline. So I think this is like a month after Dark Force ends.
I actually don't know. I know that it's 5 years after Return of the Jedi.
I was just trying to figure out how long it is after Dark Force Rising, but they kept bringing up a month. So I was like, I think it's a month after Dark Force ends, because it doesn't go right in.
Yeah.
So there's some...
Well, that makes sense.
Some time. So I think it's a month after, but I'm not sure.
That sounds good to me. I mean, given some of the things that take place even in the first chapter, right, that makes sense.
Right. Yeah, it makes sense to me too. What I thought was really interesting and what I really liked was the back and forth in this chapter with Sabaoth and then Pelion and Pelion's thoughts, and how Sabaoth was like sowing seeds of distrust, and how Pelion knows he can read his thoughts, but like can't necessarily like control them, I guess. So, like he doesn't want him to know. But then Sabaoth sowing seeds, and Pelion knows what's happening, and he's like trying not to think things. And even how one thing that Sabaoth says to him is he will not always be right, because Pelion was thinking like, what if Thrawn's wrong, or what if Thrawn messes up? And then he says that as he's thinking that, and so you can see there's already some distrust with Pelion and Thrawn in his private thoughts. And I think it's just kind of funny how Sabaoth is just kind of messing with him with his thoughts, and sowing seeds of distrust further of Thrawn, and that he's maybe not perfect. That was a really interesting back and forth going between his thoughts, Sabaoth's words, and then even like Pelion just being conflicted. And man, I can't even think around this guy. Like I just got to get out of the room. I also thought it was interesting. Sabaoth says that I am the Empire, and it reminded me of when Palp says he's the Senate. Yeah, I was like, okay, I see that. crazy Sith guys. They want power, so it makes sense. But I don't know if that was intentional, like in the prequels, like if they kind of took that or just happenstance, because there's just one word different, Empire, Senate. So that really stood out to me too. But before I share more, I want to let you share too. I don't just want to share all my notes.
No, yeah, and I think that's, I thought the same thing of I am the Empire.
And I even read it like that. Like I read it like Palpatine saying I am the Senate.
Yeah, that's awesome. No, and it's hard saying. I mean, we would have to like listen to audio commentary and see if there's some nugget that says that, because otherwise we're just inferring. But no, I thought the same thing. That definitely, it seemed like there was a lot of inspiration for that line drawn from this book. Yeah, I mean, what I found interesting is even how this book starts. Because a lot of times, if I'm being honest, I mean, we read a lot of nonfiction, which is more argumentative and is more proposition based. And I also read a decent amount of fiction. I used to read a lot more, and primarily now most of my fiction is Star Wars. And I think a lot of times people with like Star Wars and sci-fi, they think like, oh, well, it's just cheap thrills and action. But I'm paying particularly close attention to how Timothy Zahn both starts his novels and how he ends them. And what I found really interesting about how he starts this is it's like he's launching the final attack against the rebellion.
Yeah.
And he's been plotting and planning, and now he's finally ready to wipe out, and he still calls them the rebellion. And so leading the remnant of the Empire, he's very much in the position where he's like, I want to once and for all wipe them out.
Right.
And we even had some discussion before recording about where it's like, oh, well, you see like 8 of the Katana fleet are with this Star Destroyer, 10 are here. So you see this back and forth, which is pretty cool. And yeah, I just found it interesting too that they were spread thin, the rebellion was. And yeah, I also had I am the Empire in my notes, which is funny. But yeah, so right off the bat, I like how you almost feel like you're missing some things.
Yeah.
Because you're just...
That's why I was like, where are we in the timeline? What's happening?
Yeah, but then you think about it as films, and it's like you just get dropped in to action right off the bat. Which also, interestingly, I guess, would be reminiscent of in just a decade later, or a little over a decade, 12 years later, Revenge of the Sith, you're just dropped into space battles.
Right.
So that's pretty interesting.
But it like captures your attention, and you're like, I gotta figure out what's going on. Like it's a good hook. Absolutely. Yeah, and then just what I liked most about this chapter was probably Sabaoth, however you say his name. I don't know if I'm saying it right. But I liked all his interactions. And how he's talking about how he wants to go back to Wayland and have a special clone created just for him, and it's B2332-54.
That's so funny because I
wrote it down because I'm like, there's something to that.
I know what it is.
I figured you did.
But I wrote it down too. That's so funny that we both wrote down sample B2332-54.
Yeah, I don't know what it is yet, so I was like, that seems like important, so I'm gonna take note of that in my handy dandy journal. And so I did. And then what also was interesting was kind of helping with the timeline. It said within, I think, 2 months, Sabaoth learned to concentrate his Jedi power and like control it. And so like 2 months ago, Thrawn was saying to Pelion like, oh, Sabaoth isn't a threat because he can't control. And then Pelion's like, oh no, this guy can control it. He's not straining as much in his face. And then obviously he's like controlling this crazy attack. And then that gets crazy because he gets sidetracked with his own thing, and then kind of like it's a little further on in the chapter. But
well, what's interesting, again, thinking of this like a trilogy and comparing everything, you have early on in Heir to the Empire, he definitely like internalizes, and he's spread way thin, and he can't get all the results he wants. Where now things just seem very efficient.
And he's very confident now.
Yes.
Very confident.
And even his interactions with Pelion have changed.
Mm-hmm.
Where
He just likes to mess with Pelion.
But man, what was interesting is Pelion just walks in the room and he immediately starts like controlling his mind.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, it's interesting because you haven't really seen. I mean, let's just say you've just watched 4, 5, and 6, right? You watched the original trilogy. You haven't really seen this Force ability played out very much. And so seeing it kind of hinted at and touched, and then seeing Sabaoth run with it, it's interesting for sure.
But it was interesting because the skill of Sabaoth, where he can control and not strain, is what makes him a threat to the Empire. And so now he's getting that, and he's improving in short term. So Pelion's starting to freak out. Yeah, we don't really see Thrawn freaking out yet. But it's hard to ever tell what's going on in Thrawn's mind. He's pretty level-headed and isn't showing his emotions, so I don't know if he's freaked out. I would assume not, because he's probably like 8 steps ahead. But I know he's not in the EU forever though at the same time, so he does have his end, and I don't know when it is. Maybe it is in this book. I'll find out.
Well, let's continue on a little bit more with the narrative, because it does before we shift, as the book shifts to our heroes,
right?
It does continue a little bit more. So specifically in the book, they're over the planet Yukio, and essentially it's just another planet that they're capturing to have shipyards and to have like basically kind of a place to have more resources for the Empire. And this really cool thing transpires from the Empire. So essentially what they have Sabaoth do is like have these drop ships like go under a planetary shield, and they're cloaked. And then the Chimera, this Imperial Star Destroyer, is above the planetary shield, and they're sending, like, the people see, and they know that the Empire's here, and they're sending a message. The Chimera is sending a message to the planet and basically saying, hey, lower your shields, let us in, or we're going to come in. And there's not really much of a response at all, and Thrawn's like, okay, here's what we're going to do. The Chimera is going to fire at this place on the planetary shield, and their turbo blasters, they can't penetrate the shield, but then these cloaked ships are going to fire simultaneously from about that same location down to the ground. And so it's this really kind of ingenious trick to get them to lower their defenses, because they're like, oh man, they can get through our shields no problem. And it works. And this firing sequence happens, and Yukio, the people of Yukio, surrender, and basically they're trying, like, at the end to kind of like get some benefit to where it's not like complete enslavement. And basically they're like, man, we don't want to be part of the Imperial war machine. But really you see Thrawn's mastermind here, being able to like take planets so efficiently, because essentially I may be paraphrasing him, but he's like, we don't want a destroyed planet. No, like we want a planet intact, which is really interesting, because he's not just, he doesn't go in guns blazing. He thinks through things, and we've seen that. This has been a theme where he's a different kind of threat. It's not just muscle. It's very much his mind. But then you have all these clones and dropships taken to the ground. And yeah, they just start taking over Yukio. And there's this whole systematic surrender that they have to do, which is interesting. But
and I think it's Pelion who's, I think they're all thinking about how Sabaoth's able to like control them, and he's like, oh, is it because they're clones, or
Mhm.
because he's a clone, and he's trying to like process. So he doesn't even seem fully on board with the clones. Like he doesn't
Yeah.
seem to like trust clones and think that they're maybe ready. But so that was an interesting dialogue as well.
Yeah, and you know, there's actually something, and we're getting ahead a little bit, but I mean, it's not a short chapter. There's a lot going on.
Yeah.
But they talk about like that clones, I think it was like 2 years. No, 1 year. My notes say 1 year. That basically, and I mean, maybe this is retconned by
Oh, the
all
maturity.
the stuff. Yeah, but
I have the whole quote.
you have the whole quote.
Yes.
Okay, awesome. So the paraphrase before you read the whole quote is basically that it's like within like 1 year, clones kind of go insane. So why don't you read that quote?
No clone grown to maturity in less than a year would be stable enough to sustain or survive outside of a totally controlled environment.
Yeah, that was interesting.
Yeah, very interesting, because I know obviously this is before and it references the Clone Wars era as well. I don't necessarily see that in the Clone Wars.
No, I don't either. And I think this is the way, maybe, because I think, aren't they talking about like specific research?
Yes.
And like they've read research papers and stuff
from the Clone Wars era. Yeah.
The way it fits in my mind, and maybe somebody who knows more about canon would say differently, but the way it fits in my mind is that they're so far removed from the Clone Wars and there's been so much devastation that they just don't have a full picture.
Well, and they did say there's not much on it.
Yeah.
And so maybe there were a couple clones and they did write on them.
And we
they
see
were-
that production ramped up,
Right.
and maybe they just couldn't research. But it is interesting, because then at the top you're like, wait, hold up, like what's going on?
Right.
You know? And so really, but then again, it paints this picture of like, what are you going to do when all these clones start going insane?
Right.
So yeah, but probably your favorite part of the
To
chapter,
our heroes.
Sabaoth starts smiling and cackling and getting all giddy,
Yeah,
and
he's
he's
a weird
found
dude.
found Leia.
Leia Organa.
So, yeah, let's take it from generally there.
I just think it's funny that he's just like, forget your plan. I found what I wanted, and just, and that he's not afraid of Sabaoth. I love that. Or
Thrawn.
Thrawn. I love that.
And he is angry
yeah,
at Thrawn.
yes.
They're
angry at each
arguing
other, yeah.
and fighting.
Yeah, that's an interesting back and forth, but I really like. It's so refreshing to read this trilogy and see the continued character development from Return of the Jedi, because that's not what we got with Disney. So it's just so refreshing to see Han like have these attributes of like a good dad and a good husband, and already caring about his babies and all that. And I thought it was sad that he thinks it's his fault that the Empire got the Katana fleet, and like he takes like personal responsibility, and he's just always so concerned about, and it's just so different to see him like that, but it's so in line with where he ended in Return of the Jedi. So that was really, really refreshing, just seeing how much he cares for Leia and how worried he is about her and the babies. Yeah, I really liked that.
No, I think you're right on. I mean, yeah, just honestly, the Disney canon just dragged them through the mud.
Yeah.
And wanted to lift up their own characters and didn't drag their own characters through the mud.
Everyone was dragged through the mud.
But with this, it is refreshing, because it's before the Empire, bought the franchise, so to speak.
Before the dark times.
Before the dark times. But one thing that I thought was really cool, basically you have this whole thing where Han and the Falcon and Wedge, they're trying to get away from TIE fighters and Star Destroyers and all this stuff. And basically they're gonna jump to hyperspace and go somewhere else. and everybody gets too close to them, and they're going to pick up the coordinates, and they're just going to chase us.
And then they're like, remember this?
Yeah.
Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah. And they start talking about like Hoth and Endor, and they're like, hey, do you remember this? There's some cool stuff. But then they do, basically they're talking back and forth, and they're talking about one specific instance where it's like they add a digit to the end of everything, which gets you generally in the same place, but it's like a couple light years off. But then they remove the last digit.
Right.
And so again, you see this cool, like, boom, they take off. I'm like, man, that's pretty cool. But yeah, Leia, this theme of Leia and the Force keeps coming up, because then she talks about how
the sense or the feeling.
Yeah. And it was around where the Death Star was. And she's like, she like still kind of like felt his presence. So yeah, it's just interesting. There's a lot of different things going on here.
Yeah. And then at the very end, I don't know if we want to come back to this, but it seemed like Sabaoth was like potentially wiping Pelion's memories.
I don't know if he was.
Or did he just forget?
I figured it was something about the Jedi mind control. Because even when you think about just Star Wars, like A New Hope, and when Obi-Wan Kenobi's like, these aren't the droids you're looking for, and like move on. They just seem to be like, yep. Right. So that was how I took it.
Okay.
But I mean,
that was interesting.
But yeah, and then because you actually read that Pelion's like grasping.
Yeah.
He's like, something about Wayland. It's something about clones. It's like there's like a fragment of it there.
Because a couple chapters before, he's like, oh, I need to make sure to tell Thrawn this. And then so I was figuring like Sabaoth knew his thought, and he's like, this can't get to Thrawn, so I'm gonna make sure he doesn't remember it. That's how I read it. I don't know.
Yeah. Well,
we'll soon find out.
Yeah, we will soon find out, and that's chapter 1.
That's chapter 1.
That's how it starts, right off the bat.
It's awesome.
Yes, it is.
Thanks for joining us on this thrilling adventure through the pre-Disney Star Wars novels. If you're hungry for even more content and want to support the Two Star Wars Nerds book club, we invite you to become a patron on our Patreon.
By joining our Patreon community, you'll unlock exclusive bonus episodes, get early access to episodes, and even have the chance to suggest future book selections. Your support helps us continue exploring the expanded universe and bringing you more in-depth discussions. So head over to our Patreon page and become a patron today. May the Force be with you, and happy reading.